we've got David Sanger and the rest of the group coming on. Just a quick intro. We have the moderator, David Sanger, who is our White House correspondent du jour from the New York Times. We have Mark Montgomery, former executive director of the U.S. Cyberspace Solarium and running Cyberspace Solarium 2.0. Kelly Bissell, corporate vice president of Microsoft, and Candace Frost, adjunct professor at Georgetown University, famous for all a number of things. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll leave that with you. And David, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Great to be part of this panel with a group of great friends, Kelly and Mark and Candace. So I think I will dive right into it. You probably all saw some stories that we wrote over the summer about the growing evidence that Chinese malware is in American infrastructure, power grid, but not just the power grid, also water supplies and so forth. And that there's a predominance, or appears to be a predominance of it, in the areas around military bases. There had been an early warning, Kelly, I think from Microsoft, about Guam, and that was followed up by a U.S. government official description of this. But the issue has gone far beyond that. It's been the subject of many a deputies meeting in the White House. There's been a lot of questions about how to go confront the Chinese about this, whether or not it is useful to confront the Chinese, or whether you just go about trying to find and neuter this stuff. If you do so, does that just create an opportunity for other Chinese groups to come in perhaps more stealthy ways? So I think I'll start with you, Kelly, since there had been such interesting work done at Microsoft on this. I want to just sort of describe the discovery and then how far you think it was. I think the way the wording was initially done was Guam and the United States, which read a little like the tail wagging the dog, but let us know.
Yeah, the way we see it is there are not just one thing, but a few things that are happening at the same time. So yes, most frequently in Guam, but also defense contractors around that area, but not just in Guam, but in Southeast Asia as more broadly, no doubt in Taiwan and in the United States and other places. So it's not one place, but a shotgun approach for how they are trying to get into all these entities around the world.
Great. Mark, since it is of the New Year tradition in my religion, tell us how this day differs from all other days. I mean, we've been seeing Chinese activity in this arena for a while. Interestingly, when the Russians were discovered inside infrastructure, the U.S. government was very public about it. In fact, to the point that the FBI and DHS, I think it was pre-CISA days, turned out a fairly lengthy public description. That did not happen here in this case, and I thought that was an interesting difference.
I think that's true, although I do think they did a very scheduled leaking, right, where two separate NSA employees on the same, senior employees, like Rob Joyce and one other on the same day, went out and began to discuss the problem. So I think there's probably that has to do with the politics of the issue right now, the geopolitics of the issue with the Chinese, that we're not issuing like a combined DHS, FBI, NSA advisory about Chinese malevolent behavior. On the other hand, we definitely, to back up, Microsoft's work, the NSA leaked the existence of this in a way that made it, that the press then very professionally, picked up on and wrote about. So I think that is how we're going to get a warning these days against a peer adversary. Was that kind of discussion. I think maybe 5 years ago or four and a half years ago, when we did the one against Russia, we didn't see him quite that way.
So Candace, you left your job at Cybercom in the spring, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And tell us a little bit about how this was building, because until this time, we had seen a lot of, obviously, Chinese theft of intellectual property, but only in the past couple of years have we begun to see China sort of picking up elements of the Russian playbook, going into infrastructure, obviously the influence operations, which we'll get to a little bit later on, but particularly on the infrastructure side. I've heard very different theories about what we're looking at. One is they generally want to understand what our infrastructure looks like. The second is they want to focus on areas that would likely be involved in a response in a Taiwan incident, and thus the Guam explanation. And the third one is that they see this as a great deterrent against the United States. They want this to be seen, and they want it to be seen as a warning to any future American president. You might want to think twice before you got involved in the internal matter between us and Taiwan.
Well, I think your three options are pretty spot on, but I would hone in on your second one, where I really truly feel that they are not only in protection of their arena, but also we are seeing objective and actually targeted malicious focus on different kind of post-compromise credentials, specifically Australia and some of their neighboring countries. They have searched, and China used to be a say and spray almost type of operation, and now the targeted operations that we've seen are very close to our C4I, or specifically both of our communications C2 arena. So so much of this to me looks at Taiwan and what the potential activities we should see in the future in that arena, less so clearly to our political leadership here. I think it's much more so in a military apparatus.
Hey, Dave, can I jump in on that for a second? Agreeing completely with what Candace said, I would also say this is about what we call operational preparation of the environment. They're going in and they're doing the cyber surveillance and reconnaissance, identification of what kind of tool you would want to install, go back and develop the tool, build a tool, and then go install it and test it. And they're doing that. This is what, in theory, our offensive teams do to our adversaries. They're doing it to us. And this is very much targeted at our military mobility. I think it serves much like we do deterrence, but if deterrence fails, defeat the adversary. They're doing this as a deterrence, and probably they aren't too bothered that some of it's caught. I think they're hoping that Microsoft didn't find all of it, or that there's another tool that we haven't detected at all. And their idea is that our military mobility, our rail, air, aviation systems that support the APODs, aviation points of departure, shipping points of departure, and then the electrical power grids and telecommunications that service them. Those kind of 5 broad areas, I think, are the prime focus of this operational preparation environment. And we should expect to see more and more of it. And frankly, we are really, really vulnerable to this.
So Kelly, as you all looked at this and turned out your warning, how well hidden was this, or was this intended to be found?
Oh, it was not intended to be found, but we want to dig as deeply as we can, right, to find all, like Mark said. And I would add healthcare to that list of industries as well. So I think that it's not one set of tools, but many tools, because if we find one but not another, then maybe they still have a point of entry. And so, David, I think we can bet that China is using all means necessary to get into the infrastructure, learn as much as they can, and begin their long-term planning.
Kelly, some of this has come in the form of hardware as well. And you may recall a few years ago, during the Trump administration, there was a finding, a lot of concern around both hardware and software that was in some large power generators that we brought in from China. You may recall they were sent off to one of the US weapons labs. And after all of the study there, that's what resulted in the Trump administration's bulk power executive order, which was basically an effort to take a close look at where we were buying some of these supplies. That order, interestingly enough, has now lapsed. And so I'm wondering, what did we learn from that set of incidents from it? That seemed to be sort of the balloon surveillance of what we're now finding here.
Well, I'm curious of what Candace and Mark think about this, but I do think that hardware, having devices in hardware is both a positive and a risk for them, because if you find it, then they're shown to the world, so to speak. But it's difficult to find sometimes. So I think this is a delicate balance when it comes to offensive work. Software is a little bit easier,
Candace, I see you nodding out here. Tell us what you can about this.
I think the biggest part that we see them trying to get into the hardware, I mean, we've got great leaders in our field, and I think because our industry is so much further advanced than so much more of the China efforts to really work in competition with us, we still hold that hardy advantage. But the software arena is just, that's literally the soft underbelly where it's so much easier to take a step forward in that arena. Mark, did you have anything?
A few thoughts. One, in IT hardware, I agree our military does some of its own, but the reality is the vast majority of IT hardware development is now done overseas. So we really do have a physical security opportunity for an adversary. We found some of this. There's been reporting in the Wall Street Journal and others about some 200 megawatt generators that came over from China. There was also some accusations about servers that at least caused DoD to destroy a lot of the servers. That doesn't make it true or not true, but I would just say that they've got in there. I'll throw one other conundrum in, and that's firmware. I actually think that's probably, it's the least addressed issue. If you go into our legislation, we barely address it. The NIST standard on it is extremely weak. And it's everywhere by definition. And we don't even have a system really for patching it. So we're somebody to say, I see a problem. I'm not sure how we fix it right now. And I know the big data center contractors like Microsoft and Amazon are starting to ask hard questions about this. So, I mean, there's vulnerabilities galore, David, but I'd put it in all three: software, hardware, and firmware.
Right, Mark, and I think
one of the interesting areas that this has been big has been the software and service providers. And I know you guys have been doing some study of that. Tell us what you found.
Look, we find that it's easiest for the attacker to get through a service provider, whether a managed service function or a help desk or other things. We've seen it in Ukraine, right? We've seen it in other avenues. We're seeing it in Taiwan today. So I think it's important for us to not only strengthen the supply chain of software and hardware, but also the services industry, because that's the easiest path for them to get through many targets.
Any new findings in this about how they're doing it and how it differs, from the kind of work we've seen from Russia?
And I wouldn't say anything interesting new. Most of the service providers that we see successful attacks are really still elementary in nature. It's unpatched systems. What we would think of as cyber hygiene, lack of multi-factor authentication, some SIM swapping of system administrators, things like this that in the service provider space, I think it needs to shore up a little bit.
So about a week and a half ago, we wrote about in the Times about some of the interesting Chinese disinformation operations, which is something that a few years ago, Candace Cyber Command was barely paying attention to. I mean, as General Nakasone made the point the other day, when he came in, it was all about elections. It was, the 2018 elections were approaching. It was what they were learning from that. And as he leaves, I find in my own discussions with him and the things that he said publicly, he is much more attuned to the disinformation operations than I think he was when he came into the job. And as a result, I think we've seen NSA and Cyber Command both also be more attuned to it. So what was really interesting that we found was the disinformation they did around the Maui fires. Basically arguing that the United States had a weather weapon, which maybe explains how come it's rained all summer, but that they were making use of this. And it sounds a little bit crazy, but they were building on the fact that everybody knows that there's equipment up in Maui that we've used up near the peak of the volcano for testing on lasers, anti-satellite devices, so forth. So there's just enough of a germ of activity in Maui that you could, build on that to build a false case. Some of the people I talked to said this isn't about the fires in any way. It wasn't a terribly successful disinformation operation, but it is reminiscent of what the Russians were doing in 2015 as they were building their network to use in the presidential election the following year. What was your read of this? I realize this all happened after you left Cyber Command, which probably makes it easier for you to talk about.
It makes it much easier for me to talk about. And I think some of the great reports we've seen from Citizen Lab, Microsoft itself, and also Mandiant that have come together to really write about China's entry into this space, especially using AI. I think that's really critical that they have harnessed in 40 different languages, billions of different messages that they've tried to get on social media sites. We know Meta already shut down about 7,700 Facebook individual accounts, over 100 different pages. So China has truly leaned into this space, taken some lessons from Russia and actually amplified and improved their messaging process and system by using the really almost rudimentary tools of what's out there with respect to ChatGPT and AI. So as we kind of peer further forward, we can definitely see this amplified in upcoming elections. And I know, Mark, you had just spoken with me earlier about kind of some of the things they had done in the Canadian elections, if you'd like to amplify that.
Yeah, so I really think that the Chinese are, they're going to displace the Russians as the, gold medal winning disinformation champion. I mean, and then they're going to run away with the award. They've already been doing this aggressively in Taiwan. They did it in Australia, along with some other bad behavior in Australia that really has turned the Australians into one of our staunchest allies over the last 5 years. In Canada, they ran a pretty heavy disinformation campaign mixed with electoral malfeasance, which is what they did in Australia. I think we can expect to see it. I think that it's getting much higher quality. It probably has to do with AI producing the product instead of native Chinese language users. And I really think we're gonna see some problems here. And look, we're very susceptible. Every morning when I drive in, I listen to Radio Sputnik for 10 minutes or until the bile gets up in my throat. But when you listen to this, it is a constant stream of disinformation and stories. And I think we can expect the same from the Chinese. The final thing I'd say is for Chinese Americans who read Chinese press, almost all the press, I think it's in the high 90%, that's published in the United States is actually done by the CCP. So if you're a Chinese speaker trying to maintain those skills in the United States, you're being subjected to CCP propaganda about 98% of the time. That's a tough problem for us that we're gonna have to work our way through.
And
Kelly, what I found striking about the Microsoft findings, though, was that not many people read this stuff. I mean, it almost makes you. They went to like all this effort, but there may have been more authors than there were readers.
Well, look, maybe we should be more interesting in how we write these papers or how we distribute them. David, I think we do have to share this with not just our government partners, but also industry leaders, ISACs, even business leaders, the press, on and on. But one thing I wanted to add to this is the speed in which they're maturing and the scale in which they can reach. I mean, 100 million users with targeted things like Mark described is pretty impressive, and they've just started. So I do think that we as a company, and not just a company, but a community, have to figure out how do we share better, faster. And that's what
when I said not many people read this stuff, I wasn't referring to the Microsoft reports, which we all read. I was actually referring to the propaganda itself. I mean, you guys turned out some interesting numbers on the penetration of that propaganda, and it looked like it was mostly being consumed by bots. So I'm just wondering what that tells you about the, I mean, I would sign on to everything Mark said about, you know, how they could well become the champions of disinformation. But right now, they're not the champions of audience building.
But doesn't mean they won't tomorrow. And I, you know, I think it's important that we as a community are trying to publicize as much learnings as we can so we can all be safer together. But make no mistake, the threat actors are actually reading to learn, to know what we know so they can make adjustments. And so I'm not surprised by the bots at all. I actually expect that consumption so that it can either be twisted, it could be sort of debunked, or used to learn and improve.
You know, David, I agree with you that the readership is low in the United States, but not in Southeast Asia and not some of the other places where they're targeting this. And if you talk to our embassies in like Indonesia and Malaysia, they spend a disproportionate amount of time just trying to go out and disabuse, you know, Chinese disinformation. The story that the COVID was hatched at Fort Detrick is alive and well in Indonesia, Malaysia, and other places because of the prolific Chinese disinformation campaign.
And the Ukraine biological weapons lab story made its way pretty broadly. Candace, let's think ahead a little bit to 2024. I know you don't want to, but let's do so anyway. So we're going to be in an interesting position where you could easily imagine the Russians clearly are going to have a preferred candidate here, and it's not likely to be Joe Biden, given what's going on in Ukraine. You could imagine the Chinese also wanting to oppose Biden, in part because of the sanctions on China export technology and so forth, but in part because they simply benefit from the chaos that would come from a candidate who, you know, if Trump got back in, or if somebody Trump-like did, and began to talk again about withdrawing from traditional American alliances and so forth, all benefits them. Could we be in a position in 2024 where we're seeing both Russia and China in the disinformation sphere in the election campaign, or is the lesson of 2020 that this is harder to do now?
I honestly don't think it's harder to do. I think if anything, we will see an amplification in 2024 by the lessons learned from what China has seen Russia do in Ukraine to influence. And I wholeheartedly think that they'll start to maybe not necessarily back one side, but at least so the denigration of our US political figures. They're doing it already with symbols of the Statue of Liberty. They could do that to certain amplified audiences, and then we know specifically there are other audiences likely on the West Coast that they could use to amplify one message. I don't know if they'll necessarily lean forward like Russia has to pick a candidate, but anything that they can do to denigrate democracy.
We seem to have an additional panelist here. That's good, and clearly coming in to reinforce the points. One last quick round, because we only have a couple of minutes left, maybe 2 or 3 minutes left. There's a lot of debate you hear about what the role of AI is going to be in this. And Kelly, what I've heard from some of your colleagues is might make it easier for us to detect malware, but might supercharge disinformation. I've heard the alternative on the malware side as well. Let's start with you and just sort of get quick sense of where we think AI is going to help and hurt in this arena.
Yeah, look, I think we have a whole 50-year history of using technology for good or for bad. And so AI is no different. And so the point is, in this arms race of technology, how are we going to use AI responsibly? That's one. Two, how are we going to use AI to protect or detect other capabilities or other attacks from AI. So I think there's no slowing it down, there's no stopping it, but we got to figure out how do we move faster in this defensive approach for responsible AI.
Mark, you ready to start up the new AI cyber symposium here?
So no, I'm going to leave it to the work that Eric Schmidt and Ili Bakhtari are doing to keep that up. You know, they're keeping the National Security, the NSC Artificial Intelligence Commission going as a special competitive studies project. You know, I can't add much to what Kelly said. I did want to circle back on one thought I forgot to say, and it's what really just concerns me right now about these issues is that when we look at the Taiwan stuff, all the kind of stuff you write about outside of cyber, and that Mike Gallagher has been pushing about munitions and logistics and all that, it made it into the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. And so did like some cybersecurity support for Taiwan. But all the stuff on improving our ports and our aviation and the other national security stuff was left out of this year's NDAA because of a rules committee ruling by the Republicans in the House. And that's naturally where we're to come in. As a result, we are not going to move forward on cyber or AI for that matter, and the way we are in all the other issues for Taiwan. It's great that we recognize the problem. It's very unsatisfying that we don't propose solutions.
Candace, you got the last word.
My last words on AI will be deep fakes, and I really think, and I wish, Kelly, great work for Microsoft to hopefully be able to unfetter this, but I really do see that the 2024 elections will be riddled with these, and the images and videos are only getting better.
Great. Well, I want to thank all three of you for a great and rapid conversation. We could have done this for many hours, and among the four of us, we have in the past, but Suzanne would come after us if we did so I'm turning it back to her.
I don't know, I'm learning so much. It's really hard to wrap it. I think we will continue this conversation at the Cipher Brief Threat Conference as well, but I want to thank all of you. And David, thank you so much for a wonderful job moderating. Really appreciate the insights of all of you today. Thank you.